The moment the pairing list went up on that gold-framed easel in the grand atrium of the Belvedere Crown Hotel in Newport Beach, California, the laughter started before the champagne even finished pouring. Not polite laughter, not the kind you cover with a hand. Loud laughter. The kind that bounces off marble floors and chandelier glass and finds every corner of a room. And standing at the center of all that laughter, silent, calm, holding a small paper cup of water like he'd just wandered in from a bus stop, was a man named Eldon Greer. Worn khaki trousers, a beige button-up shirt that had clearly been ironed once too many times, shoes that had walked 1,000 miles and never been replaced, a wristwatch so old it probably still ran on the original battery from 1987. And next to his name on that pairing list, Vivian Alcott, CEO of Alcott Global Holdings, Forbes 40 under 40, worth somewhere north of $600 million. Hair like a magazine cover, jaw like a statement, eyes like she'd already calculated the cost of everything in the room and found it slightly beneath her. Someone near the bar, a man in a cream linen suit with too many rings on his fingers, leaned toward his colleague and said, low enough that the whole room heard, "Did they bring him from the parking lot?" The room exploded again. Vivian didn't laugh. But she didn't defend him either. She just looked at the list, then at the man, then back at her phone. And Eldon Greer? He just took a slow sip of his water. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had already seen the end of this story and was waiting patiently for everyone else to catch up. Now, before we go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the whole space decide who you were before you even opened your mouth? Before you even sat down? Yeah, keep watching, because what's coming will rearrange something inside you. The Belvedere Crown Charity Gala was one of those Newport Beach events where the ticket price was a down payment on a small house, and the charity part was a footnote on the press release. Every year, the city's most powerful players, tech billionaires, old money real estate dynasties, investment wolves, and designer wool, gathered under the pretense of giving back. What they really came for was each other. The deals, the visibility, the quiet handshakes in hallways that moved mountains before breakfast. This year, the organizers had added something new, a blind date charity pairing, where wealthy attendees were matched with surprise guests to raise funds through sponsored dinner conversations. The idea was, bring in some fresh faces, make it interesting, let cameras capture the magic. Nobody had told Vivian Alcott that the fresh face she'd be sitting across from would arrive looking like he'd missed his Greyhound bus connection somewhere in Bakersfield. The pairing was real, no mistake. Eldon Greer, assigned seat 7A Vivian Alcott, 7B. Vivian's assistant, a sharp-eyed young woman named Petra Locke, had already pulled up every public record search available within 30 seconds of seeing the name. LinkedIn, nothing. Instagram, nothing. Twitter, nothing. A ghost. Vivian. Petra's voice dropped to a whisper. I can't find anything on this man. Like, nothing. Everyone has something. Vivian smoothed her cobalt dress and started walking toward table 7. Find it. What she found instead was the man himself. Up close, Eldon Greer was somewhere between 60 and 65. His face had the kind of lines that don't come from age, but from weather, from hardship. His hands, when he pulled out her chair, yes, he pulled out her chair, were rough at the knuckles, with faint, pale scars running along the left one like old rivers on a map. Miss Alcott. His voice was quiet, unhurried, like a man who'd never once rushed a sentence in his life. Thank you for sitting with me. Vivian sat, said nothing for a beat. Around them, the room was already performing. A man named Dustin Frey, tech investor, serial smirker, the kind of person who had a podcast about authentic living despite owning 4 yachts, was openly holding his phone up, filming Eldon's shoes for his group chat. 3 tables over, Colette Waverly, heiress to the Waverly Media Group, was whispering to her date behind a menu, eyes dancing with cruelty and amusement. A waiter passed their table, once, twice, without stopping. Eldon didn't flag him down, didn't raise a hand. He just watched, observed. Vivian noticed that. She flagged the waiter herself. 2 waters. And the full menu, please. The waiter nodded, avoiding her eyes, and moved on. They'll warm up, Eldon said simply. Will they? It wasn't a question. No. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. But they'll pretend to. The first course arrived, seared scallops on a smear of something orange and expensive. Eldon looked at it the way a man looks at something he's seen before from a distance, and now, finally, up close. He ate slowly, properly. Vivian watched him from her peripheral vision. He used the right fork. He knew which bread plate was his. He didn't reach across anyone. Strange, she thought. Not the behavior of someone unfamiliar with a formal table setting. Conversation around them had picked up, loud, performative, the usual gala noise about quarterly earnings, and Hampton Summers, and whose company was acquiring whose. Dustin Frey was holding court 2 tables over, voice carrying like he'd been trained to project. The Meridian acquisition is essentially done. Southeast land block, all 47 parcels. The last holdout signed last month. Something shifted in Eldon's face. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw. Gone in under a second. But Vivian caught it. You know something about that deal? She asked quietly. Eldon lifted his water glass. Old land, that region. Family's been there since before the war. Which war? Does it matter? He set the glass down. Point is, some things have value that doesn't show up on an acquisition spreadsheet. Vivian studied him. What do you do, Mr. Greer? Right now? A pause. I'm having dinner. She almost smiled. Almost. The moment the main course landed, prime rib, asparagus, the full ceremony of it, was the moment Hartwell Bryce decided to make his entrance. Hartwell Bryce was the kind of man who collected power the way other men collected watches. Real estate empire across 5 states. Political donors list that read like a Senate roll call. He was 60, silver-haired, permanently tanned from a life spent outdoors on things he owned. He didn't walk anywhere. He arrived. And he arrived at table 7 with a crystal glass of bourbon in his hand, and a smirk that had probably cost someone their livelihood at least twice. Vivian. He nodded at her. Then his eyes dropped to Eldon like a man spotting a stray. And this must be the surprise. Hartwell. Eldon said the name first, before Hartwell had introduced himself. Calm. Familiar. Hartwell's smirk flickered. Have we met? Not recently. A pause. Something moved behind Hartwell's eyes. A quick calculation. The kind a man runs when he's suddenly unsure of the terrain. He recovered fast. Well, he raised his glass toward Eldon in a mock toast. Here's to charity. It takes all kinds. He walked away, but his shoulders were no longer as loose as when he'd arrived. Vivian had watched the whole 30-second exchange like a woman watching a chessboard. How do you know him? I know of him, Eldon said. He cut into his prime rib. Most people in California who've lost something do. Halfway through dessert, a lemon tart that cost more per bite than most people's lunch, Dustin Frey stood up. He was heading toward the bathroom, but the path took him past table 7. And Dustin Frey was not the kind of man who passed an opportunity. He slowed, looked down at Eldon. Then, deliberately, with the practiced ease of a man who'd humiliated people before and enjoyed it, he tipped his wine glass. Red wine, straight across the table, straight onto Eldon's shirt. The room went quiet for exactly 1 second. then burst into sound. Not concern, not apology, laughter. More filming. Dustin threw his hands up in a pantomime of shock. "Oh, my bad, buddy. Let me get someone too." He looked around, grinning. "Bring you something from the lost and found." More laughter. A woman near the back actually clapped. Eldon looked down at his shirt. The red was spreading slowly across the beige fabric. He reached for his napkin, dabbed once, set it down. Then he looked up at Dustin Frey, not with anger, not with shame, but with the particular stillness of a man who has already filed something away in a place where it will be retrieved at exactly the right moment. And he said, soft, unhurried, the way a person says something they've thought about for years, "Some debts take years to repay." Dustin laughed it off, walked away. But 2 tables over, Colette Waverly had stopped laughing. And across the room near the entrance, the hotel manager, a meticulous man named Gerald Osei, had been watching the whole scene from the moment Eldon walked in. He'd said nothing, done nothing. But now he walked to the edge of the room, pulled out his phone, and sent a text that read, "He's here." After dinner, the gala moved into what the program called Conversations for Impact. Basically, paired couples sitting in lounge areas while cameras floated around capturing the kind of content that would eventually become a tax-deductible documentary. Vivienne and Eldon were given a low table near the window overlooking the Pacific. The sun had gone down. The water was black and silver. Petra appeared at Vivienne's elbow with a small tablet. "Found something?" she whispered. She handed it over. Vivienne looked at the screen. An old newspaper article, the San Bernardino Press, dated 19 years ago. The headline was partially cut off at the edge of a scan, but visible enough. "Local family loses ancestral land in disputed contract. Son disappears following father's fraud conviction." The photo was grainy, but the eyes in it, young, sharp, wounded, were the same eyes sitting across from her right now. Vivienne set the tablet face down on the table before Eldon could see it. She looked at him differently now, not with pity, with calculation. "Tell me something," she said. "You mentioned you know old land deals in Southeast California. What specifically do you know?" Eldon considered her, like a man deciding how much of a door to open. "I know," he said slowly, "that in 2004, a company called Meridian Land Partners filed 43 acquisition contracts in San Bernardino County. 31 of them were fraudulent. The families who signed didn't understand what they were signing. Some of them couldn't read English well enough. 2 lawyers were involved. 1 politician. 3 investors who have been in this room tonight." Vivienne's jaw tightened. "That's a very specific accusation." "It's not an accusation." He looked out at the water. "It's a record." "You have documentation?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Vivienne leaned forward. Her voice dropped. "Mr. Greer, who are you?" He turned back to her then, and for the first time that evening, his face did something other than stillness. Something that looked almost like grief. Old, deep, the kind that's had years to calcify into something solid. "I'm someone," he said, "who came a long way to be in this room tonight." Across the lounge, Hartwell Bryce was on his phone, voice low, back turned to the crowd. But Vivienne, who had been trained from childhood to read a room, could see the tension in his neck from 20 feet away. She could also see, now that she was looking, that 2 other men had gone quiet since Eldon's arrival. Men she knew. Men who sat on boards she had sat on. Clifton Marsh, private equity, 3rd-generation wealth. A man who smiled like he was always winning. Theodore Vane, infrastructure developer, friend of Governor's, had a foundation named after himself that she'd donated to twice. Both of them had been watching Eldon all evening, with expressions they were working very hard to keep neutral. And Eldon, she now realized, had been watching them back. Every quiet comment he'd made at dinner, every question slipped sideways into conversation like a stone dropped into water. Who was this man? The gala wound down around 10:30. Guests filtered out in clusters, the powerful moving in their usual constellations, never fully apart. Vivian sent Petra home, stood alone for a moment near the coat check. And then she saw it. Gerald Osei, the hotel manager, walking Eldon quietly down a side corridor. Not a service corridor, a private one, the kind that led to the hotel's penthouse suites. Vivian watched him disappear through a heavy door. She waited 3 minutes. Then she followed. The corridor was quiet in the way that only very expensive floors are quiet, carpeted thick, lit low. At the end of it, a door was open, just slightly. Vivian moved toward it, not fully inside, just enough to see. The room beyond wasn't a hotel room. It was something else. A command center in the shape of a suite. 3 large screens mounted on a wall that had been swung open from behind a painted panel. Each screen divided into smaller feeds, financial documents, property records, corporate filings, surveillance footage from cameras she couldn't immediately place. A man she didn't recognize was seated at a laptop, working fast. Gerald Osei stood to one side. And Eldon Greer stood in the center of it all, still calm, still unhurried, but now wearing the authority of the room like it had always belonged to him. He was pointing at one of the screens, talking low. Meridian Partners, Vane Infrastructure, the Bryce Family Trust. He traced 3 separate threads on the document feed. Same money, 3 different shells. Followed it back to the original 2004 transfer. The man at the laptop, the civil case, filed last week, sealed for now. And the federal piece? Eldon was quiet for a moment. Patience. Then he turned, and his eyes found Vivian in the doorway. He didn't look surprised. He looked like he'd been expecting her. Miss Alcott, he said, close the door. There's something you need to understand about the people you've been doing business with. And that, right there, is where everything changes. Because the man nobody saw, the man they laughed at, the man whose shirt they stained with red wine while they filmed it on their phones, he wasn't lost. He was exactly where he planned to be. The screens glowed blue-white in the penthouse suite. Vivian Alcott had not sat down in 40 minutes. She stood with her arms crossed over her cobalt dress, the same dress she'd worn to the gala, now wrinkled at the waist from hours of standing, and she read. Document after document, transfer record after transfer record, photographs, scanned affidavits, court filings from a county courthouse that most people in Newport Beach had never heard of and would never visit. And the more she read, the colder she got. Not cold like fear. Cold like the moment you realize the ground beneath a building was never solid, and you've been standing in it for years. San Bernardino County, Eldon said, from behind her. 2004. There were 11 families on that land block. Some of them had been there since the 1940s. 2 of them had deeds going back to the 1920s. Vivian didn't turn around. And the contracts they signed were fraudulent. The language was deliberately buried in legal clauses that even a trained attorney would need 40 minutes to untangle. These were farmers, a few mechanics, 1 retired school teacher. He paused. They weren't equipped. Who drafted the contracts? A silence. Then, a firm called Waverly Vane Associates. Vivian's head turned slowly. Waverly. As in Colette Waverly's father. Yes. The room felt smaller. And Vane Infrastructure, she said. Theodore Vane. He's been on 3 boards with me. He has. And the Bryce Family Trust. Hartwell Bryce provided the political cover. He was county commissioner at the time. He made sure the fraud complaints never made it past the clerk's desk. Eldon moved beside her, pointing to a document on the center screen. 3 complaints filed by affected families in 2004. All 3 were logged, and then quietly closed. Same week. Vivian stared at the filing dates, then the closure dates, then the signature at the bottom of each closure form. H. Bryce, County Commissioner. Her stomach dropped. Mr. Greer, her voice was very quiet, your family was one of the 11. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the screen the way a person looks at something that used to be their whole life. My parents, he said finally, owned 42 acres in the Yucaipa Valley. We grew citrus, had been growing it since my grandfather broke the ground. A pause. My father signed the contract in March 2004. He didn't understand that he was signing away mineral rights, land title, and the right to legal recourse, all in the same document. By June, Meridian Land Partners had filed for possession. By August, we were served. He fought it. He tried. Eldon's jaw tightened. They framed him for fraud instead. Said he'd falsified the original deed. The case moved fast. Too fast. He didn't have money for a real defense. The court-appointed lawyer was barely out of school. He stopped. Swallowed once. He was convicted in November 2004. 18 months. He served 14 before he was released. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. My mother, Eldon continued, voice unchanged, measured, deliberate, was a woman who had never been sick a day in her life. Strong woman. The kind that carries everything and shows nothing. He looked at his hands, at the scars. She didn't survive the stress of it, the humiliation, losing the land, watching my father go to prison for something they fabricated. He paused. She was gone by the time he came home. The room was completely silent except for the hum of the screens. Vivian turned to face him fully, and for the first time all evening, the CEO armor, the posture, the calculation, the careful management of every expression, slipped. Just slightly. Just enough. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it without decoration. Eldon looked at her. Don't be sorry. Look. He gestured at the screens. Every person in that ballroom tonight who laughed at my shoes, every one of them is connected to what happened to my family. Some directly. Some through money they accepted. Some through silence that they chose. He let that land, including people you trust. Vivian went still. What do you mean? He moved to the third screen, pulled up a corporate flowchart, a web of shell companies and holding groups so dense it looked like a city from above. He pointed to one node near the center. Alcott Capital Partners. Subsidiary investment. Meridian Land Partners. 2003 to 2006. Vivian's blood went cold. That's my uncle's division, she said. Not mine. I wasn't even in the company yet. I was 19. I know. Eldon's voice didn't accuse. You weren't involved. But Reginald Alcott was. He co-signed the expansion funding that made Meridian's fraudulent acquisitions possible. Without his capital injection in late 2003, the whole scheme collapses before it starts. Vivian stood there. Her uncle Reginald, who had taught her to play chess at age 7, who had given the toast at her mother's funeral, who had handed her the keys to Alcott Global the day she turned 31 with tears in his eyes, and told her she was the best thing their family had ever produced. Her uncle Reginald had funded the destruction of 11 families. She put one hand on the edge of the desk. Just to have something solid. Vivian turned to face him fully. And for the first time all evening, the CEO armor, the posture, the calculation, the careful management of every expression, slipped. Just slightly. Just enough. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it without decoration. Eldon looked at her. Don't be sorry. Look. He gestured at the screens. Every person in that ballroom tonight who laughed at my shoes. Every one of them is connected to what happened to my family. Some directly. Some through money they accepted. Some through silence that they chose. He let that land, including people you trust. Vivian went still. What do you mean? He moved to the third screen, pulled up a corporate flowchart, a web of shell companies and holding groups so dense it looked like a city from above. He pointed to one node near the center. Alcott Capital Partners, Subsidiary Investment, Meridian Land Partners, 2003 to 2006. Vivian's blood went cold. That's my uncle's division, she said. Not mine. I wasn't even in the company yet. I was 19. I know. Eldon's voice didn't accuse. You weren't involved, but Reginald Alcott was. He co-signed the expansion funding that made Meridian's fraudulent acquisitions possible. Without his capital injection in late 2003, the whole scheme collapses before it starts. Vivian stood there. Her uncle Reginald, who had taught her to play chess at age 7, who had given the toast at her mother's funeral, who had handed her the keys to Alcott Global the day she turned 31 with tears in his eyes, and told her she was the best thing their family had ever produced. Her uncle Reginald had funded the destruction of 11 families. She put one hand on the edge of the desk, just to have something solid. 6:15 in the morning? The Pacific was pink and gray outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Belvedere Crown's executive floor. Most of Newport Beach was still asleep. Vivian had changed into a spare suit she kept in her car, a habit her assistant Petra thought was excessive, and that Vivian had never once regretted. She sat in the hotel's business lounge with a black coffee she wasn't drinking, staring at her phone. 14 missed calls, 4 from Reginald, 6 from Theodore Vane, 2 from a number she didn't recognize, but would later find out belonged to Hartwell Bryce's personal attorney. They knew Eldon was here. They'd known since Gerald O'C's text the night before. He's here. She understood now what that text meant. It wasn't a warning sent to Eldon. It was a warning sent about him, to someone in the network. The hotel manager wasn't Eldon's ally. Or rather, he hadn't been, until he was shown what the alternative looked like. Her phone buzzed. Petra. Emergency shareholders meeting. Alcott Global. Called for 9 a.m. Someone triggered the emergency clause. Investors are freaking out. Vivian typed back. Who called it? 3 dots. Then, anonymous majority shareholder. She set the phone face down. She already knew. The Alcott Global boardroom occupied the 41st floor of a glass tower in downtown Newport Beach. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a table that seated 30. Art on the walls that cost more than most people's retirement funds. By 8:50, every seat was filled. Investors Vivian had known for a decade sat rigid in their chairs, whispering. Hartwell Bryce was present, uninvited but present, the way powerful men are always present in rooms they feel entitled to. Theodore Vane sat with his hands folded on the table so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Clifton Marsh was on his phone, then off it, then on it again. Reginald Alcott sat at the far end of the table in his usual seat, silver-haired, patrician, wearing the quiet authority of a man who had chaired 1,000 meetings. But his eyes, Vivian noticed, kept moving to the door. She sat down without greeting anyone. At 9 o'clock, exactly, the boardroom doors opened. And Eldon Greer walked in. Not in khaki trousers. Not in the wine-stained beige shirt. A charcoal suit, bespoke, fitted without a single wrinkle. The kind of suit that cost as much as a car and wore it lightly. Shoes that reflected the overhead light. A watch, not old, new, discreet, expensive in the way that only people who understood expense would recognize. Behind him, Two men in dark jackets who positioned themselves at the door without a word. Beside him, a woman in a gray blazer carrying a briefcase that she set on the table and opened with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Every person in the room who had been in that ballroom the night before, every single one who had laughed, who had filmed, who had raised a glass and mock toast, went completely, utterly still. Hartwell Bryce's face lost its color so fast, it was like watching a light switch flip. Theodore Vane's folded hands came apart. Clifton Marsh put his phone face down on the table, slowly. Eldon walked to the head of the table, Reginald's end of the table, and stood there. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. The woman with the briefcase began distributing folders, one to each seat, thick folders, tabbed and labeled. Nobody opened theirs yet. They were all watching Eldon. "Good morning," he said, the same quiet voice from the gala, the same unhurried cadence. "I'll keep this brief." He let the silence hold for 5 full seconds. "My name is Eldon Greer. Most of you know me as the man whose shoes were discussed at last night's charity event." A pause. "Some of you know me by a different name, one connected to a land dispute you believed was resolved 20 years ago." Reginald Alcott's hands, flat on the table, pressed down hard. "I am the anonymous majority shareholder of Alcott Global Holdings. I am the silent founder of Meridian Pacific Trust, which acquired controlling interest in 14 subsidiary corporations, several of which are represented in this room. And I am the son of Walter and Claudine Greer, whose family land in the Yucaipa Valley was stolen through a fraudulent acquisition scheme coordinated by the people sitting in front of me." Nobody spoke. The woman with the briefcase said, calmly, "The folders in front of you contain a full evidentiary record. Corporate filings, wire transfer receipts, falsified deed documentation, and recorded communications, some spanning 2 decades. Federal investigators received copies at 6 this morning." Hartwell Bryce pushed his chair back. "This is—" "Sit down, Hartwell." Eldon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You had 19 years to speak. Today is not your day." Hartwell sat down. Vivian watched her uncle's face across the table. Reginald Alcott, a man she had never once seen, rattled, not through market crashes or hostile takeovers or the death of his wife, was rattled now. His jaw was working slowly, like a man chewing on words he couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. He looked at Eldon, and Eldon looked back. And in that look was 20 years of weight. "The Alcott capital injection," Eldon said, turning slightly toward Reginald, "was the spine of the operation. Without it, there is no Meridian Land Partners. Without Meridian, there are no fraudulent contracts. Without the contracts, 11 families keep their land. My father doesn't go to prison." His voice didn't change, but something underneath it did. Just slightly. Just enough. "My mother doesn't die." Reginald opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "Eldon, I didn't know it would go that far." "You knew enough." Eldon's voice was still quiet. That was what made it devastating. "You knew enough to sign. You knew enough to stay silent when the complaints were filed. You knew enough to keep accepting returns on the investment for 6 years afterward." He picked up one document from the folder in front of him, a single page, and placed it gently on the table between them. "That is your signature in 2003 on the Meridian Expansion Agreement." The room looked at the page. Reginald looked at it and said nothing. What happened next moved fast. It always does, once the first stone shifts. By 10:15, 3 federal investigators had arrived in the lobby downstairs, the kind that don't call ahead. By 11, Theodore Vane's personal attorney had appeared and pulled him from the room. By noon, Clifton Marsh's firm had released a statement, poorly worded, clearly drafted in panic, distancing itself from past business relationships under review. Hartwell Bryce tried to leave at 10:30. He made it to the elevator. He did not make it to the lobby. The media got it by 1 o'clock, not because of a leak, because Eldon's team had prepared a press package with the same meticulous care as the legal filings, timed to release the moment the investigators arrived. By 3, it was the top story on every California news outlet. By 5, it had gone national. Newport Beach charity, gala linked to 2-decade land fraud scheme, multiple arrests expected. The photographs from the gala, the ones the guests had posted themselves, laughing and celebrating, wine glasses raised, were now running under that headline like a caption that wrote itself. Colette Waverly, who had whispered behind her menu the night before, was photographed outside her Laguna Beach estate at 2:15, sunglasses on, moving very fast toward a waiting car. The car didn't take her where she wanted to go. Vivian found Eldon on the building's rooftop terrace at 4 o'clock. The city spread out below them. The Pacific glittered in the distance, indifferent and ancient. He was standing at the railing, jacket still on, not looking at his phone, just looking out. She stood beside him. Neither spoke for a moment. "My uncle," she said finally. "He'll cooperate. He already called his attorney 20 minutes ago and authorized full disclosure." Eldon didn't look at her. "It'll reduce his exposure, not eliminate it. He'll lose everything. He should have thought about that before he signed." Vivian absorbed that. "I know. I'm not defending him. I just—" She stopped, tried again. "He raised me, after my parents." She stopped again. Eldon turned to look at her then. Really look. The calculation she'd seen in him all evening was still there, but underneath it, now that she was close enough, was something else. Something that recognized pain the way only people who have lived inside it can. "I know," he said simply. "How do you not hate all of us?" The question came out smaller than she intended. "How do you sit in that room and— I watched you last night. They poured wine on you. They filmed your shoes. And you just smiled." Eldon was quiet for a long time. "I spent 8 years angry," he said at last. "The kind of angry that eats your sleep and poisons your food and makes strangers seem like enemies." He looked back at the water. "Then I spent 12 years building, because I realized anger without architecture is just noise. I didn't want to make noise. I wanted to make something that lasted." Vivian looked at his scarred hands on the railing. "When did you start?" she asked. "Building this." "The day my father came home from prison," Eldon said. "He was 61. He sat down at our kitchen table in the apartment we were renting. Nothing left of the land, nothing left of the house. And he didn't cry. He just looked at me and said, 'Eldon, don't waste your life being a wound. Be a verdict.'" Vivian was quiet. "Be a verdict," she repeated. "He died 3 years later." Eldon's voice was even. "But he got to see me start. That was enough for him." A pause. "I made it enough for me." 14 months later. The Yucaipa Valley looked the same from the road. Same pale hills. Same long sky. Same citrus smell when the wind came through right. But the land was different now. The 42 acres had been returned through a civil settlement that Eldon's legal team had structured so precisely that there was no room for appeal, no room for delay, no room for the kind of quiet maneuvering that had buried the original complaints 20 years before. All 11 families received restitution. 9 received their land back directly. 2, whose original parcels had been developed beyond recovery, received equivalent land value plus 2 decades of compounded damages. It took 4 months of court proceedings and one very uncomfortable deposition from Reginald Alcott, who aged visibly in the process, to make it happen. On a Saturday in October, Eldon Greer stood on his family's land for the first time since he was 23 years old. The citrus trees were gone, cleared years ago. The house was gone. The barn was gone. But the ground was still the ground. He crouched down and picked up a handful of soil, let it fall through his fingers. Behind him, a crew had already broken ground on the first structure. a small two-room schoolhouse that would eventually grow into the Claudine Greer Community Learning Center, named for his mother, built on the exact spot where the family kitchen had stood. 3 months after that, a medical clinic opened 2 miles down the road, the Walter Greer Health Access Clinic, the first of its kind in the valley, funded fully by the Greer Foundation for Rural Equity. By the following spring, 17 young people from the valley, children of the families who had lost everything in 2004, received full scholarships to universities across California under the Greer Restitution Scholarship Fund. Not charity, restitution. There was a difference, and Eldon insisted on the word. Hartwell Bryce received 41 months in federal prison. Theodore Vane received 36, plus asset forfeiture that stripped his foundation of every dollar it had accumulated through fraudulent means, including the building that bore his name, which was purchased by the county and repurposed as a community legal aid center. Clifton Marsh avoided prison through a cooperation agreement, but lost his firm, his board seats, and everything that had been built through the Meridian Network. He was last seen at a real estate seminar in Phoenix, name tag on, nobody recognizing him. Colette Waverly settled civilly. The settlement amount was sealed, but the Waverly Media Group was restructured under new leadership. Leadership that notably included several journalists her father had fired for trying to cover the original land story in 2004. Reginald Alcott cooperated fully and received 18 months probation and community service. He lost his seat on the Alcott Global Board. That seat was offered to Vivian. She took it. Then she called Eldon. The call lasted 47 minutes. She told him she'd restructured 3 of Alcott Global's subsidiary investments to exit any entity connected to the original Meridian Network. She told him she'd established an internal ethics review board, not a decorative one, a real one, with actual authority. She told him she was donating 15% of her personal equity this year to rural land rights organizations across California. There was a pause on the line. Then Eldon said, "Why are you telling me?" "Because," Vivian said, "you're the only person who would understand why it matters." Another pause. "Come to the valley," he said. "When the school opens, bring Petra." The Claudine Greer Community Learning Center opened on a Thursday in November. The valley was cold that morning, the way high desert gets cold, sharp and clean, the kind of air that makes you feel like your lungs are being used properly for the first time. Kids ran across the new concrete path. Parents stood in clusters, some of the older ones quiet in the way of people who remember what this land used to mean. Vivian Alcott arrived in a rental car. No driver, no Petra. Petra had taken the day off, on Vivian's insistence. She walked across the grounds in flat shoes, no heels for once, and found Eldon standing near the entrance where the kitchen of his family home had been. He looked at her when she arrived. "Different shoes," he said. She looked down. "Different day." They stood side by side for a moment, looking at the children running toward the school's open doors. "Why did you hide who you were?" Vivian asked. The question she'd been holding for 14 months, saved for this exact moment. Eldon watched a small girl in a red coat race past them, laughing at nothing, full of the kind of joy that doesn't need a reason. "Because," he said slowly, "money shows you what people want, but how they treat you when they think you have nothing." He paused. "That shows you who they are. And I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with." Vivian thought about that. "And what did you see?" she asked, "when you looked at me?" He was quiet for a beat. "Someone," he said finally, "who noticed the waiter was ignoring me and flagged him down herself." Vivian looked at him. He almost smiled. "It's a small thing." "It wasn't," she said quietly. "No." He looked back at the children, at the school, at the sky above the valley that his grandfather had broken ground under 100 years ago. "It wasn't." Inside the school that morning, 22 children from the valley sat down at desks for the first time in a building that bore the name of a woman who had held the same ground with nothing but hope and two bare hands. Outside, the citrus trees they'd replanted along the fence line were too young to bear fruit yet. But they were growing. If this story moved you, and I believe it did, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And in the comments, tell me, who in your life has been an Eldon Greer? Someone overlooked, underestimated, written off, who turned out to be everything. Drop their name or story below, because this comment section deserves to be full of people like that. I'll see you in the next one.